Hi, I'm Zach Giltz, and this is video 4, which is going to cover a few things from chapters 7 and 8 in our book, and that's going to be over kinesics, or the study of human body movements. So right off the bat, what are kinesics? Well, body language. So it's everything from gestures to posture, facial expressions, eye behavior, and even the rate of our walk, which I thought was really interesting. Birdwhistell is one of the founding fathers, if not the founding fathers, of the study of kinesics. And he's got principles that we'll get into. So he's got 6 principles, and then we'll look a little down the line at a functional approach to kinesics. But starting with Birdwhistell, each of his 6 principles covers how we study body movement and how that study leads to understanding the communication. So his first principle is about the interdependence among the 5 senses with communication, and that alongside verbal communication creates this intra-communication system. So basically it's all connected. How we communicate non-verbally and verbally all comes together. And a really good example of this from the book is a hug, right? So if you are kind of expecting a nice warm hug from somebody, they come in and give you that big bear hug, right? Like that communicates a warm greeting, whereas if somebody comes in and gives you kind of a leaned out, kind of arms around the shoulders hug, right? It's a warm gesture, but it still leaves you feeling a bit cold, right? So there's just different things that we interpret with all of the different kind of senses involved with that of touch and perception of things. So his second principle of kinesics is that kinesics communication varies according to culture and even within subcultures. Which just makes a ton of sense to me, right? If you think back to proxemics, it's a whole thing where just kind of where you are dictates so much about what's kind of appropriate, set by precedent and stuff. And so the same is true for kinesics, right? You don't want to just come into a different culture with what you have always known, but rather kind of learn what's appropriate. And so so it differs culture to culture. And then I think they had kind of some self-admittedly outdated stereotypes present in the book. But this definitely made me think of how we greet different people, right? And so whether it's a handshake or a hug or kind of the cheek kisses, each culture kind of has their own greeting with that. So I don't know, just something that came to me. Third principle, third of Birdwhistell's principles is that there is no universal body language symbol. And that's really fascinating to me because it goes into it that kinesics is a learned behavior. All of our nonverbal communication is learned, similar to our verbal communication. And so it really, really depends, again, culturally where we're at, who we're learning from. And so there's no one symbol that communicates one thing as a through line. The fourth is that the principle of redundancy does not exist within kinesic behavior, within this body language behavior. Because oftentimes these gestures, right, like I do it a lot. If you watch this video or any of my videos, really, I am prone to gesturing, but it more reinforces what we're saying verbally. And so we're not really necessarily getting into redundancy, but rather into reinforcement or complementary type of communication. Birdwhistell goes on with that kinesic behavior is more primitive and less controllable than verbal communication. So again, both of these are learned behaviors, but if you've ever been in a situation where you've been shocked, you may have gasped, but certainly like your eyes will kind of pop out, right? Like you'll kind of, whoa, what? But you might necessarily say the whoa, what, right? And that's just a little bit less controllable. Again, more primitive, comes right off. Similarly, if you're kind of like, oh, that's so dumb, you might not say the so dumb part, but the eye roll kind of initiates almost immediately. And then lastly, within Birdwhistell's principles is that comparing nonverbal codes, that we ought to compare nonverbal codes time and time again in context before we can make accurate interpretations. So don't judge a book by its cover, right? One interaction, you might stereotype, make assumptions based on someone's posture or their walk rate or kind of whatever kinesic you're interpreting. And yet you kind of have to do that multiple times to actually get an accurate read on how to interpret that person or the culture or the setting that you're in. And then kind of in line with this, but a little bit different take on kinesics is by Mehrabians. Mehrabian and his functional approach. So this is another kind of founding father of this body language interpretation. And he has 3 functional groups. And those are pleasure, displeasure, dominant, submissive, and arousal, non-arousal. And we'll kind of break those down here. So pleasure, displeasure, or liking, disliking is oftentimes kind of measured by your body orientation, how relaxed you are, how tense you are, right? So if you really engage with, you like the person that you're talking to, you're going to kind of face them, maybe be a little closer with them, right? And you'll likely be a bit more relaxed. Whereas if you're around someone that you don't agree with or you dislike, right, you're experiencing displeasure, you're a bit more tense, you might kind of start to turn away from them and kind of put more between you and that person to convey that you are in displeasure, you're not liking that. Dominant, submissive, this one makes a ton of sense, right? And so it's just kind of the power differentials that exist. So kind of cartoonish examples, but you know, if you're of a lower power status, right, you might kind of come in, kind of hat in hand kind of deal, kind of your head down in order to talk to somebody who's of a higher power status than you. And then conversely, they might be kind of making themselves a bit taller, tower over you if they're in the higher power position to kind of convey those roles non-verbally that are already kind of entrenched. And then lastly, is this arousal, non-arousal? Again, this isn't necessarily romantic or sexual arousal, but just, are you interested? Are you engaged? And oftentimes if we are aroused, if we're interested, we are engaged, that blood pressure is going to go up, our heart rate's going to go up, our muscle tension will kind of go up a little bit, pupils dilate, and then you just have more movement in general. So kind of the more engaged you are, the more your physical body is responding, which creates more of these kind of physical responses. And language, whereas if we are not aroused, right, all of those things are kind of leveled off. We're less engaged. We're not quite, our responses aren't quite there. Even those primitive ones, we're not really reacting even facially necessarily to what's going on. Touching briefly into chapter 8, kind of the first thing right off the bat that stood out to me was the variables that impact kinesics. And so that's going to be culture, kind of going back to Birdwhistell's principles, but that culture really, really matters within this conversation. And that's because that these are learned behaviors, right? It really depends on, again, your context, your culture, all those things. Sex and gender roles are things that we learn, right? And so a lot of times you'll see kind of boys looking to men, and you see when they're upset, you know, it's not okay to cry, but maybe to get angry, where girls kind of see a woman get upset and try to kind of just smile through and push through that instead of crying. And so kind of both really unhealthy modelings and ways to learn those gender roles, but again, kind of the most dominant ways that we can see those societally. And so those are a couple variables. A couple that I don't really want to get too into because they were a little bit in the weeds for me. So maybe somebody made a video that explains it better. But left-handedness versus right-handedness, this seemed kind of like not a ton of studies been done here, but there was some like life outcomes kind of pointing to that left-handed people generally have slightly less favorable life outcomes than right-handed people, which I thought was fascinating and worth noting. And then our relationship with language really impacts, again, one of those variables that impacts kinesics. But kind of the last thing I want to hit on before closing up is that ultimately all of this is moot if it is not decoded, right? So we're encoding all of these messages. We're sending all of these messages non-verbally. And yet if it's not decoded, if it's not received, then it's kind of all for nothing. And so the biggest, to me, variable that impacts kinesics is how we understand those and how they play out to us. So cool. Thank you all so much. If you made it to the end, thanks for hanging out, and I look forward to seeing y'all's videos. Have a great week. Bye.